My name is Jen Higgins-Newman, and I'm the program director here at Beacon Hill Friends House, which is a Quaker center for learning and action, as well as an intentional community based in downtown Boston. And we are so glad that you showed up for this conversation, telling the unvarnished history of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Today we have LJ Boswell and Nur Shoop, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. LJ will introduce Nur, and then Nur will be giving the presentation, and LJ will be leading us through a practice at the beginning and some small groups after the presentation. So welcome, friends. We're so glad to have you here for this conversation, and I'm going to turn things over to LJ to introduce Nur.
Thank you. Welcome, friends. Nur is just a delight for me to be able to introduce you to. She is, I know her through my Quaker community. She is a member of the New England Yearly Meetings Racial, Social, Economic Justice Committee. And she is also a Sankofa scholar and lead tour guide with the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire. And she's been with them for 8 years. She runs the Thirst for Freedom tour, which is one of several tours that the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire offers. And her tour in particular focuses on the Portsmouth, New Hampshire area's slave economy through the civil rights movement. As an experienced tour guide, Nur has developed key strategies for sharing and interpreting conflicting histories and is certified as a guide by the National Association for Interpretation. So we are extremely blessed to have her here, if I can use that word in this interfaith gathering, or I don't know if that word works for you, but I'm delighted and excited to have Nur here share her expertise and her passion for this, delving into history and helping it heal us and inform us in what we need to do today. So she asked me before she does her presentation to just do a brief guided exercise with you to help you really get ready to listen deeply. She's going to be telling some hard truths and some truths of resilience and stories that inspire. So I have a guided visualization from this book, My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. And Jen is going to put the link to this book in the chat if you are to Resmaa's website. It's a book about racialized trauma and the pathways to mending our hearts and our bodies, and I highly recommend it. So this is just one exercise. So I invite you now to just settle in your chair, and if you're comfortable, close your eyes or soften your gaze and ground yourself in your own body. Notice the outline of your skin and the slight pressure of the air around it. Experience the firmer pressure of the chair, bed, or couch beneath you, or the ground or floor beneath your feet. Can you sense hope in your body? Where? How did your body experience that hope? Is it a release or an expansion? A tightening born of eagerness or anticipation? What specific hopes accompany these sensations? The chance to heal, to be free of the burden of racialized trauma, to live a bigger and deeper life? How do you sense hope in your body? Do you experience any fear in your body? If so, where? How does it manifest? As tightness, as a painful radiance, as a dead, hard spot? What worries accompany the fear? Are you afraid your life will be different in ways you can't predict? as you engage with this material? Are you afraid of facing your pain? Are you worried of inflicting pain on others? Do you feel the raw, wordless fear and perhaps excitement that heralds change? What pictures appear in your mind as you experience that fear? If your body feels both hopeful and afraid, congratulations. You are just where you need to be for what comes next. As you listen to Nur, I invite you to notice when fear arises and notice when hope arises, and notice the outline of your skin and the slight pressure of the air around it, and that you are being held. And Nur, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, LJ. Good afternoon, friends. My name is Nur Shoop, and I frequent Dover Friends Meeting in Dover, New Hampshire. So before we get started, I like to tell people that what I'm going to present to you today is Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire's mission is to teach the unvarnished hidden history of the area. And some of this is hard history. So you may feel some discomfort, and I encourage you to lean into the discomfort. I know that when I'm learning something new or hearing something for the first time, because it's unfamiliar, I feel some discomfort, but it's always beneficial after I get through it. So, and I like to also start with land acknowledgement. The area that I am in when the colonialists arrived was not vast, empty land. It was, there were indigenous population living here. And the area that I'm in, it was the Kawasak, the Pennacook, and the Abenaki people who formed the Wabanaki Confederacy. So we are on native land. And the other thing I would like to acknowledge is the my tour, Thirst for Freedom, and the information you are going to be hearing today is all based on Valerie Cunningham's book, Black Portsmouth, which is available. I think you can buy it online. You can certainly order it if you're interested through the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire's website. It was from her decades of research when she's an African-American woman from Portsmouth. When she was in middle school, she asked the local librarian, Portsmouth librarian, Dorothy Wan, if there was any Black history, books on Black history at the library, and there was none to be had. So she started her tireless research, and all the information you'll be hearing today is based on her research on her book. So I just want to also acknowledge that. Okay, so let's get started. So this presentation is a port of entry, boys and girls for sale, the slave trade in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, because the tours that I'm doing are mostly from Portsmouth. But during colonial times, New Hampshire was part of the Massachusetts colony. So a lot of this history still applies to Massachusetts as well. So, okay. So the slave triangle was what they took from America's sugar, tobacco, cotton to Europe. Then they used to bring textiles, rum, and manufactured goods to Africa. They, in case you're wondering what the manufactured goods were, they actually were weapons. So they were selling weapons to the Africans, sometimes to both sides of the conflict. Then they would take the captured Africans and bring them to the Americas and sell them as enslaved population. So from the 16th to the 18th centuries, an estimated 12 million Africans crossed the Atlantic to the Americas in the transatlantic slave trade, used on plantations throughout the United States, Latin America, and Caribbean, enslaved Africans were shipped largely from West Africa. Until recently, slave studies rarely discuss children's experiences in the transatlantic slave trade. It has been estimated 1/4 of the slaves who crossed the Atlantic were children. From the 16th to the 18th century, 12 million Africans were sold into the slave trade to work on plantations in the United States. Like adults, children were unwilling participants within the slave trade that had a variety of sources. Kidnapping was a common method of capturing children. When men were killed in battle, women, children, and the elderly became especially vulnerable. Those who were not killed or ransomed were sold into slavery. Children were snatched while working in the fields, walking in the outskirts of town, or innocently playing outside away from their parents' view. Children were taken to trading posts where they were sold into slavery. Although children received some preferential treatment, most children suffered experience similar, if not equal, to the adults traveling alongside them. And this is inside the slave ship. So you can see where the Africans, the captured Africans, were shackled and chained. So when they were captured, they were stripped of their name, they were stripped of their language, their culture, and their religion. And imagine what it was like at the bottom of the ship. If you look at this picture, the sounds and the smells, because they ate, they slept, they went to the bathroom where they were, and the smell, people crying, people moaning, people dying. If en route you became ill, they threw you overboard, because the enslaved on the ships were cargo, just like any other cargo. They actually were insured, and they automatically figured 15% loss en route in the from Africa to the Americas. So if you imagine 100 people got on board the ship, the slave ship, to come to the Americas, 15 were going to probably not make it. If you got pink eye en route, they threw you overboard because they were insured. So let's see. Between 1728 and 1745, Portsmouth captains Morse, Dickinson, Major, Bailey, Audiorn mastered ships owned by wealth Portsmouth families, Long, Pierce, Rindge, Wentworth, bound to Guinea, Virginia, and Barbados. Their cargo typically included 1 to 12 enslaved people, among other merchandise. An impressive exception occurred in 1755 when a vessel owned by John Muffet, the Exeter, carried a larger number: 20 men slaves, 7 more slave boys, 10 boy slaves, 15 women slaves, 2 women girls, 7 girl slaves, 61 slaves. They were probably destined for sale by 1s, 2s, or 3s. Import records do not survive to tell whether this large scale instance was one of a kind venture or one of many. So what you're looking at is the wharf at Prescott Park, which is in Portsmouth today. So I want you to think about the waterways back during colonial times as the highways, or like 95 of today, because it was much easier to travel over water. So most of the enslaved Africans to Portsmouth, which was at the time the Massachusetts colony, was by water. And they would sometimes auction them right at dockside. Other times there were a couple of taverns that they would actually auction them at. So The earliest record in Portsmouth during 1645, when it was a Massachusetts colony, was a slaver named Captain Smith. He brought several Africans from New Guinea to be sold, and he sold it to Mr. Williams of Piscataqua, which is the river that runs between Portsmouth and Kittery, Maine. And we know about this because there's a court record that says that Mr. Williams was ordered by the court to return this African back to West Africa. The objection was not the immorality of owning another human being. The objection was when this African was captured, his village was raided and over 100 people were slaughtered, and it happened during Sabbath, and that was the objection. There are no other records of this African, so we don't really know if he ever got returned back. My guess is most likely, since it was quite expensive to have somebody voyage back to Africa, he probably got moved to another colony and got sold to someone else. So let's see where I'm at. So this is Studley's Tavern, and Studley's Tavern was where colonials met. They ate, they drank, they socialized, they conducted business on the first floor. And on the second story of this building, if the enslaved population was not sold dockside, they were brought here and they were auctioned on the second floor of this building. And in 1774, Paul Revere was one of the stops Paul Revere made during his run. Here is an ad to be sold at public venue at James Studley, which is the owner of the Studley's Tavern. 3 Negro men and a boy. The conditions of the sale will be in, I'm not sure what that was, or good, merchandise boards. Anyway, 1762. Studley himself owned a couple of enslaved people. We know this from his probate. Valerie Cunningham, who wrote Black Portsmouth, she found a lot of the, her research is based on court records, newspaper clippings, church records, and probate. And when Studley died, in his probate, it says that he had 2 people that he owned, Frank and Flora Studley. So when you were captured, you were stripped of your name and you were given a name from literature or myths, and you took the last name of your enslaver. So Frank and Studley would have had Studley's last name. At the time of his death, Flora was valued at 100 pounds and Frank was valued at 20 pounds. Usually men were worth more, but in this instance, from that we can assume that probably Flora was younger. She was at the prime of her life, and Frank may have been older and he may have not been as productive, and that may be why he wasn't worth as much. Here is another one that talks about on the road to Rye near John Langdon's, 1 yoke of oxen, several steers, cows, sheep, good horse, several calves, foundry, other things, wearing apparel, also a likely Negro girl. Now, in this instance, likely means she was amiable. One of the hard things to hear about the history of the area that I live in is they actually preferred children in this area. And one of the reasons, there were probably numerous reasons, but one of the reasons probably was that children are in the care of their parents before they're captured and sold into slavery. And they don't really know what freedom is like. So they probably were more likely not to resist. And likely in this instance, a likely Negro girl means she was amiable and she did not resist. Sometimes they would advertise them as 2 years with English. And the other thing is, of course, children also are young and they're like sponges, they learn. So they were easier to train. And also they were probably going to live longer because they're younger. And here is another one by William Pern at his store near Mark Hunking, Wentworth, cotton wool. And at the very end, also one Negro man about 20 years of age. And now we are at Penhallow House. And Penhallow himself was a notary, justice of the peace. And there are records when one of the ministers from North Church, Ezra Stiles, metamuted his enslaved person, Newport, and his wife, Violet, who had bought her freedom recently, and their child, Jacob. They went to Penhallow and they had to register with him their freedom papers, their manumission papers. So it was common during colonial times, if you wanted to attract a minister or a pastor to your parish, you offered them a house, you offered them a salary, you offered them 2 cords of wood, and you usually offered them 2 enslaved people. So most of the clergy in the area actually had enslaved people in their households. This is the house of John Langdon. And oops, I went too far. He actually, one of the things that George Washington had dinner here at this house. And he also had a couple of people that were working at his house, Cyrus, who worked for him, and his wife, former Flora Studley from Studley's Tavern, she bought her freedom and he married her, and they lived in behind the mansion in one of the 2 houses Governor Langdon owned on Washington Street. And sorry about that. I think I jumped ahead. No, I did not. So one of the things that that house is tied to is, I don't know if any of you have heard of Ona Marie Judge, which was, she was the escaped enslaved person of Martha Washington. And she got on Captain, oh gosh, I'm sorry, I'm having a senior moment. She got on the ship Nancy, and she escaped up here, Captain Bowles's ship. And she actually was living in Portsmouth, and Langdon's niece saw her and went back to Philadelphia and told the Washingtons that she was up in Portsmouth. And George Washington tried to negotiate her return a couple of times and it didn't work out. And eventually he sent his nephew up here, who was staying in this house in the Langdon mansion. And over dinner, they were discussing how Washington's nephew was going to kidnap Ona Judge the next morning and bring her by force back to the Washingtons. And we're not clear if Langdon himself or one of the people that were working in his household, Cyrus Bruce or his wife, told Ona, but she had been warned, and by morning Ona had fled to Greenland, New Hampshire. And there's a book about her called Never Caught. So if you wanted to read more about that, you could certainly get that. We also have that at Black Heritage Trail offices for sale. You can get it on the website, or I think you can even order it on Amazon or one of the other places. In built in 1766, is most remembered. This house is Stavers Tavern, as scene of revolutionary turmoil and visit of famous patriots. Enslaved people were recurrent part of tavern owner John Stavers' life. In earlier years, Stavers was charged with beating someone else's black servant. He also auctioned people imported from West Indies, advertised for his runaway 16-year-old slave named Fortune, and he charged a fee to view a 9-year-old albino African boy. On Wednesday, January 29, 1777, Mark Noble, suspicious of John Stavers' patriotism, began chopping down the tavern sign. Stavers sent James, his enslaved man, to stop him. James knocked Noble unconscious. Stavers was arrested and tried for suspected disloyalty. James was reportedly found hiding in cistern in the basement, afraid of retribution. James was neither arrested nor charged with assault. Later, when the two neighboring women forced James to steal food from the tavern for them, they, not James, were charged with theft. Unlike the West African law, which was founded in family and community obligation, James was invisible in American law. His status, identity, and actions were observed into his masters. So the reason he wasn't charged was because, as far as the law was concerned, he was under direct order of his master, and that is why he didn't get in trouble, but his owner did. And this is the Met Mcfederis House. A merchant named Mcfederis built this, and his sister actually married another merchant named Warner. And Warner had himself enslaved population. To Cato and Peter were among the 20 African who signed a petition to the legislature in 1779 to abolish slavery. So it was tabled, and it was actually signed into law by Governor Hassan in 2015. It was published in the New Hampshire Gazette, which is the oldest publication in the nation, for the amusement of its readers. But 20 Africans wrote a very eloquent request asking for freedom. And well, Muffet Ladd House is remembered as the home of the Declaration of Independence signer William Whipple. William Whipple himself had two enslaved Africans, Cuffy and Prince. Now, Cuffy and Prince were not clear if they were brothers or cousins, but they were definitely related. They actually were royalty, and they were sent abroad to get educated en route. They got shackled and sold into slavery, and William Whipple bought them. And it was promised that if you accompanied your enslaver during Revolutionary War and you fought, then you were supposed to be freed after the war ended. Unfortunately, Prince did not get freed till 1785. So, and they're still arguing over whether it was William Whipple himself or his widow after he died, because he also died in 1785, that freed Cuffy and Prince Whipple. But Cuffy and Prince actually married Rebecca and Dinah, and they so this is not the picture of the wooden structure. This is what's there today. But at this location, there was a wooden structure. William Whipple's widow allowed them to build a house there, a wooden structure there, and Prince and Cuffy and Rebecca and Dinah lived there. And this is the location of the first Black school in Portsmouth, because Rebecca and Dinah were part of the African Ladies Charitable Society, and they educated young Black children and also sometimes illiterate adults as well. And this is North Church. This is a place where George Washington sometimes worshiped there. So did William Whipple. And Studley actually went there from Studley's Tavern. And usually the enslaved went to church where their enslavers worshiped. So Frank and Flora Studley would have been in the church, except they would have been in the balcony. So whether you were enslaved or free, you were as far away from the pulpit as they could put you. So you would have been in the balcony, where Studley himself had a pew right up front near the pulpit, because I guess he had quite a lot of power in the community. So in the church records, it talks about, so the difference between Southern slavery and Northern slavery, one of the differences is people were more isolated. You had 1 or 2 people per household, and most likely they saw each other Sundays when they were worshiping. And in the church records, it states that they assigned people to the balcony so that the population, the Black population in the balcony, would not socialize, and they would actually pay attention to the sermon. And right now you're looking at Portsmouth, a street on Portsmouth in 2003. And if you look up the street, you can see there is a street, but the area between the 2 houses all the way up, actually that is an African burial ground. And don't know if I have. Okay. So in 2003, when they were trying to fix a manhole cover, I'll go back. The manhole cover that's right past the crosswalk, I don't know if you can see it, but there is a manhole cover there, and it was leaking, and they started digging. They knew it was there because there are records of Portsmouth from 1705. Maps say Negro burial ground. And also from a newspaper clipping from 1853 from the Glebe, that talks about some of the, during construction on that street, they came across some African burial, some coffins, and they covered them back over. But what happened is they actually just knew it was there. It was the outskirts of town. And as the town grew, they just basically paved over it and built over it. So in 2003, when they hit the boards, they stopped and they decided that they were going to do something about it. So the community got together and they applied for some grants, and some of the businesses also donated, and they built the African burial ground. They're estimating that over 200 people are buried there. They're definitely, those houses that you see in the photo are definitely built over African burials. So it took 10 years to finish, and in 2013, there was services at New Hope Baptist Church, which is the local African-American church in Portsmouth. And what you see in this picture are the coffins that were made. A local artisan, Jeffrey Cooper, made smaller coffins because some of the remains, the sewer had been running through them for so many years that there wasn't a lot left. So he built coffins for each individual remains, and they were brought by horse-drawn carriage to the burial ground, and the elders from the community carried them. and they were re-entered into that vault there. We had an overnight vigil at the African burial ground, and then the whole community came out. We had services. And this is what it looks like. There's a statue at one end, and this is what it looks like at night. So, okay. So I usually, people in the community did come forward and offer burial plots because it did take 10 years for the remains to get re-entered. But there was a man with a child buried over the top of him, and they didn't know what the relations were to the other people at the burial ground. So they decided to put them back together in the same cemetery. So Jerome Meadows was the man that designed it. It was a challenge because if you noticed in the photograph, I'll go back to before. There are houses there, there were working businesses there, so they had to make it work for everyone. So, and I think we're out of time. So thank you, friends. If you're in Portsmouth, please go by and see it. They have done a great job.
Thank you, Nur. I just want to give a minute to hold all that you shared. So now we have a period of time where folks can ask clarifying questions. And to do that, what we want is for folks to send those questions in the chat to me, and I will read them aloud. And I'll start with the first one. So someone asked if you could skip ahead a bit and talk about some of the civil rights history of the area, if you have anything to share about that.
Yes, absolutely. So the Seacoast NAACP was organized in 1958. African-American electrician named Cobb started it. And the parish from St. John's was watching in 1963 what was happening on TV with the civil rights movement. And they formed what's known as SCORE, which stands for Seacoast Council on Race and Religion. And they got together with the NAACP, and a lot of the people belonged to both groups. So there is since I don't think any of you are from the area, there is a place called Wentworth by the Sea, which is still a hotel in Newcastle. It's still the higher end hotel. In 1964, after the passage of the civil rights movement, it was still segregated. So if you were a person of color, you couldn't eat, drink, or sleep there at that hotel. So they decided they were going to actually desegregate it. So they made out a plan and they made a bunch of reservations. And the, sorry about that, folks, my phone is ringing. But anyway, and so the white people showed up first, they got seated, and eventually the black couple came. And they gawked at the idea of the Black people coming in to sit and eat. So they decided, there was a scuffle at the door and arguing, and it went on for quite a long time. And there was people from the NAACP sitting there and actually taking notes because they were planning to legally challenge it in court because the Civil Rights Act had passed. But eventually the owner buckled and he allowed them in and had them sit by the kitchen. So that's how they desegregated Wentworth by the Sea. So segregation, so, we were taught myths about how segregation was a Southern problem. It wasn't up in the North. And that is not true. People of color couldn't just go eat, drinks, sleep, stay overnight or buy gas anywhere. It was not safe. The least you were going to be is going to be humiliated. The worst was you could get locked up or you could get lynched. So after Reconstruction, right up till 1968, close to 3,500 African Americans got lynched. So that's a lot of people, folks. And SCORE also, Seacoast Council on Race and Religion, raised money. They sent people, they marched with MLK in Boston. They sent people to register voters down south. And they also sent money to hire buses to get people to the polls. So that was some of the things that they did during civil rights movement here. I don't know if any of you have heard about the Green Book, but the Green Book was put together by Victor Green, who was an African-American postal worker from Harlem. And he decided to compile, he wrote to other postal workers across the country, and he compiled places that was safe to eat, drink, buy gas. Because down south, it was obvious where it was safe to stop. It was clearly marked where you could or could not go. In the north, it wasn't so obvious. So you needed a plan and you needed to know where you were going and where you could go and stop and where it was safe. So. And those of you from Boston area, I'm sure you remember the busing. I had already moved to the area in the early 70s. And I remember as a child watching in the news, the National Guard with the buses when they started busing children to desegregate schools. I remember that happening. So, and people are shocked when I tell them about Wentworth by the Sea, that it was in 1964, because sometimes it's in their own lifetime and they're surprised that people of color couldn't eat there or sleep there. So, and that was true all over the place. African Americans, there were several inns that they could stay at, but they couldn't just come up here and stay anywhere. And the beaches were segregated as well. There were some beaches, certain day of the week, people of color could go, and the rest of the week, the white people went. So. Does that kind of answer the question, I hope?
I think so, Nur. So another question, if you could answer, someone wants to know what the main purposes were for enslaving people in the Massachusetts Bay Colony.
So pretty much anything, really. I mean, people did grow a lot of their own vegetables too. People had their own gardens, but pretty much, and if you think about it, an enslaved person probably also would be able to help in the household, because you didn't just go to Market Basket or one of the grocery stores and buy bread. I mean, it was a lengthy process to grow food, can food, cook food, bake bread, because you had to have a lot of the wood, you had to fire the stove and so on and so forth. But yeah, in most every trade, you could buy an enslaved person, and people also sometimes mortgage them. So I don't have it on my screen, but out of 93 towns in New Hampshire, and I have lived in this area since the 70s, there are some small towns I haven't been to yet. Out of 93, 55 of them had enslaved population. So that's a lot of people, and not all those people are wealthy. So people were mortgaging them. Let's say you were a blacksmith, you could mortgage a person. Now you've doubled your production. So you could definitely pay for the mortgage, and then you definitely would have some left over for yourself. And also you, your enslaved person was worth more because now they had a trade. So they actually were worth more. So. Yeah, not everybody up here was an abolitionist, and slavery was alive and well in the North, and so was segregation. I know that we've been taught differently, but the true history is it was up here. And if you think about it, sometimes people go on the tour and say, well, you know, are you sure? And I'm like, if you think about where the original 13 colonies were, they were not in Florida and California. So if you think about where the original 13 colonies were, then you realize that it was definitely up in the North.
So another one in the chat for you, Nur, is if you could speak a bit about the connection of this history we're learning now with what is happening now in our country.
Okay. So another one of the things that people are aware of is that the GIs that came back from World War II were not eligible for the GI Bill and for VA loans. So how do we build wealth for the next generation? Usually through homes. So if you were shut out of that, how are you going to pass on to your next generation and that generation to the one after that any wealth? So we have not, we're still, and 2008 market crisis, there's a stock market crisis, the subprime mortgages, who did they target? Mostly African-American people of color. So Reconstruction, right? You know, people passed Jim Crow laws to keep the Black population. You know, they would arrest people on bogus charges, and they would actually have them work as basically slave labor, prison labor. So we're still struggling with the issues that we haven't dealt with for centuries, really. Myself, I'll be honest, I'm for reparations. So, because sometimes if somebody else got on the train, think of it that way. If somebody else got on the train ahead of you, way ahead of you, by the time you get on the train, they're, you know, way, way down the road. How are you going to catch up? Maybe you need a faster train. I don't know if that's a good example, but so, you know, after slavery, then we went into Jim Crow laws. Today we have the more people in, well, let's face it, during minimum sentencing and all that, you could literally be a cocaine dealer and get less of a sentence than somebody that had a couple of hits of crack, because crack was the drug that mostly was used by people of color. So, you know, the law was set up. I mean, and even in New Hampshire, we have disproportionate minority contact today. What that means is, if you look at the population and what the population of people of color is, and then you look at how many times the police has stopped those people, there's definitely way more contact with people of color, and they don't commit any more crimes than white people, but they're getting stopped even in New Hampshire more often. And it's nationwide, it's not just here, it's everywhere. So we have a lot of inequities that we need to really negotiate and deal with that we haven't, and it's still, from decades ago, and it's still here, but I think we can fix it. I do. I'm an optimist because we have overcome slavery and segregation, and I think we can overcome this too. I really do. I think if we have enough hearts and minds change and we decide we're going to do this, I think we can do it. I really do. But if you don't know the history and you don't understand it, then how do you move forward?
We're getting lots of questions, which is great. I want to let you know that. I'm going to ask you one more.
Okay.
And then we're going to move to small groups. So the one more I have here is, someone wants to know, how prevalent were abolitionist attitudes in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the time period you were speaking about in the presentation? And among anyone who was an abolitionist, how many of them were so because they believed that all people were equal, regardless of race, or all Black and white people were equal? Or did they have other reasons for being abolitionists?
Honestly, I'm going to tell you, I don't know the answer, but I can tell you that Quakers have a book, Fit for Friendship, but I'm sorry, Fit for Freedom, but not for Friendship. So feel free to read that, and that's the Quakers. So the other myth is that, most of the abolitionists were white because that's what we've been told, and that's what we read in history books. But most of the abolitionists were people of color. So we have to give credit where it's due. And if you think about it, if a white person approached an enslaved person and said, I want to help you escape, I'm not sure if I was enslaved, I would be trusting that white person. So you have to also realize that there were a lot of, you hear about the white abolitionists, but there is a long list of Black abolitionists that we don't really hear about, other than maybe Frederick Douglass and Wendell Brown and some of the famous ones. But there were a lot of abolitionists. There is a site in Portsmouth that is rumored to be, well, I should say rumored to be, there are no certain records because they didn't keep those sorts of records. But this one house where this husband and wife, they were African-American, and he was a baker, and they died within 6 months of each other. And in their probate, they had over 24 chairs, a lot of different size clothing, bedding, silverware, a lot of food, way more for 2 people. And he was a baker, so he was in the waterfront a couple times a day. And they also had curtains, which was not a middle class thing. This couple was definitely middle class, but this was not a middle class thing. That was a wealthy thing. And not only did they have curtains, but they had curtains in their kitchen, which was considered a fire hazard. They are in a corner lot. And so there was some abolitionist also activity in the area. And from all the makings, there was a vibrant Black community. They had started having their own worship at the meeting house. So from all that, the marks, it's there that we can assume most likely that was an Underground Railroad house. And most likely when Ona Marie Judge, Martha Washington's escaped slave, was spotted in Portsmouth walking around, she probably was staying there. After she got off Captain Bowles' ship, the Nancy, she probably was staying at that house. So, and you could see where he, being a baker, going to the ship all the time, could smuggle her right back to the house very easily. So, I can't say that I know that much about. I'm sure some people have written books about the abolitionists and their mindset and why they were abolitionists. I can't say that I know enough about it to speak to it. I'm sorry. That's about all I can say on the subject. But I encourage you to read Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship. Who's the author? Do you know, LJ, or anybody?
Yeah, it's Vanessa July, and Someone's holding it up. I'm also looking it up. Yeah,
Donna
McDaniel and Vanessa July.
Mhm.
And we just put a link to one of those in the chat, to one place where you can buy that book. So I think now's a good time to turn things over to LJ to explain how we'll do some small groups.
So wonderful. Thank you, Nur, for all of those stories. I know a lot is stirring in me, and I imagine a lot is stirring in each of you. So we want to give you some time to talk in small groups of 3 or maybe 4 at the most. And we'll have 15 minutes to discuss the prompts that are going in the chat right now. There's 3 that I would like to, Nur and I would like to suggest. Don't feel like you need to answer all of them, just what feels like the most important thing to talk about and process, to help you process what you heard and remember what you heard. So the 3 questions are, what is stirring in you now? What surprised you the most? And how does this history relate to your own family history?